for the first 170 years, from 1600 right up to 1770, the English state gathers, harvests great sums of money from the East India Company, apart from the employment that it's providing, apart from the profits that it's generating. It's also generating huge sums in income tax and in customs, particularly customs. And I think nearly half the nation's customs comes from East India Company imports. So no one's asking too many questions about where this stuff is coming from. But in 1770, after winning the battles of Plassey and Buxar, and having then done what companies will do, which is effectively asset strip and loot Bengal. So this place which had the 1 million weavers, which is the, if you like, the goose laying the golden eggs, they kill the goose. They strip the goose bare. They pluck the goose so viciously that in 1770, when there's a famine, there are no reserves anywhere. Now, famine is something that's come to India many times in its history, and anyone who reads travel accounts of people traveling in India will have come across accounts of terrible famines. It's not something that the East India Company or the British invent. But what's new is that the company has no grain reserves. Indian rulers know that in years of plenty, they must put aside grain reserves. And they also know that during a famine, they must provide employment. So a lot of the most beautiful buildings in India are built by Indian rulers at a ridiculous scale to provide employment during famines. So most obviously the great Imambara in Lucknow, which is one of the great buildings of North India off the tourist trail, but spectacular and highly recommended to anyone who wants to see fine 18th century Indian architecture. That is built by the Nawab of Lucknow at this period as famine relief measures, and starving people are given a rupee a day if they start moving bricks and stone around and helping build this enormous building. Now, the East India Company does nothing of this, and as a result, the numbers have recently sort of been come down. There've been very detailed regional studies of how many people died in this famine, but it's still 1 million people. It's 1 million dead Bengalis. And I mean, sometimes the numbers were given as 3 or even 5 million, and these now seem to be unlikely, but vast and horrific charnel heaps of bodies being washed down the Ganges, dogs picking at corpses. And this is really horrifying. It's death on such a massive scale and so unprecedented that for the first time you get whistleblowers. You get people writing accounts and sending it back anonymously to magazines. Because, there are no award-winning journalists. There are no Kavitapuris flying in to report from the front line or Raggy Omars or their equivalents. Finally, you get reports turning up in The Spectator and The Gentleman's Magazine of anonymous correspondents describing the utter horror of corpses, flies, vultures, dogs picking at the things. I mean, and even today, these accounts, we're used to seeing starvation on television and so on. But even today, these accounts are incredibly upsetting and lurid. So then what's the company's response? They are worried about their profits because it's a company. They now need the land revenues generated by Indians to buy their investment, to buy the cotton they need to buy. So they send out their armies to the villages. And in addition to the corpses which are lying on the ground through starvation, there are now gibbets put up in every village, and anyone who doesn't pay their taxes, even if they're starving, is hung. And when the news arrives at the annual general meeting that the East India Company has managed to gather its taxes in full, despite 1 million casualties from the famine, the shareholders are so pleased they vote themselves an increased dividend from 10 to 12.5%. So this is knowingly celebrating successful fleecing of Indians. I mean, it's in a sense, it's the clearest moment when you see the what this ultimately boils down to, which is piles of corpses, and then very rich people in London getting their dividends in their banks. So it continues the same for another year. And by 1772, they have stripped the bones clean. There is nothing left to harvest. They can't harvest any more revenue because there is no more revenue. And when the news of that arrives in London, there is horror. 30 banks collapse across Europe. The East India Company goes to the newly founded Bank of England, but they haven't got enough money to bail it out. Yet it is literally too big to fail. It employs too many people. It generates too much of the country's revenue for the government allow it. to allow it to collapse. So what do? They basically buy a 50% share of it. They lend it £4 million. And that bails out the East India Company. But there is a price to pay, and that is the Regulatory Act, which means that the government now overlooks the East India Company. So from this point, it becomes what I suppose today we'd call a public-private partnership. And the government interest in the company then only increases until finally in 1858, following the Great Uprising, which the Indians call the First War of Independence, but which the British call the Indian Mutiny still, when another 1 million people die, this time in action against the East India Company, Parliament finally says enough's enough, and they effectively nationalise the company in 1858. And it becomes an entirely government-run operation. But for the 250 years before that, it isn't a government operation. It is a private enterprise. It is like Facebook or Google or Amazon. Amazon, I suppose, being the closest parallel today.
Well, you talk about Amazon, and you say the story of the East India Company has never been more current. Are there companies today or in recent times who are just so powerful, who might be worth more than the GDP of some countries, who can exercise their corporate power in a way that's similar to the East India Company, who can topple governments, for example, or even have senior roles in governments? Can you see that? Can you see the ghosts of the East India Company in corporates today?
Well, of course. I mean, you don't have to be a kind of, a leftist activist to point to concrete moments in the history of the last 60 years when you have had exactly that. I mean, the most famous, I suppose, maybe not as famous as it should be, but in 1950s Iran, there's a democratic election and Mossadegh is elected. And one of the first things he says he's going to do is nationalize the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Now, when this is announced, the CIA and their mates get to work, and this is not fiction, this is not a movie. They get to work and they organize a coup, and the Shah of Iran takes over, and he doesn't nationalize Anglo-Persian oil. Similar thing happens 2 years later in Guatemala, when another socialist government comes to power, and United Fruit, who own 40% of their agricultural land in Guatemala, get the CIA to perform another coup and topple the socialist government that wants to nationalize their interests. And that coup produces the phrase banana republic. Fruits have been making their banana empire in Guatemala. Then in 1977, ITT get the CIA to topple Salvador Allende, and you get one of the most hideous dictatorships in Latin American history, with all those disappeared and the women looking for their children. All that stuff happens after ITT persuade the CIA to intervene. Now, in our own time, we don't still know the full story, but the strong suspicions that American oil interests, particularly Exxon, had a lot to do with the invasion of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which, of course, we know had nothing to do with 9/11. 9/11 was Al-Qaeda, full of Saudis. It wasn't Saudi Arabia that gets invaded, it was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, who wasn't the enemy of Al-Qaeda. How did that happen? At least in part, it was the lobbying of Exxon. And Exxon, if it were a country today, would be the 14th richest country in the world. So this is not sort of, Netflix fantasy that we watch in the evening to entertain us after our work. This is what corporations can do. And corporations, being very rich, have resources. The East India Company created this system. The first time the company is found influencing a body legislature is in 1690, only 90 years into its history. And already it's found offering share options to MPs who vote to increase its monopoly. You mentioned the fact that by the 18th century, about 40% of MPs have East India Company shares, so obviously don't want to clip the wings too badly. But you also get, by the end of the 18th century, something even more noxious, which is returned nabobs who've shipped home fortunes of 100, 200, 300,000 pounds from India, by rotten boroughs, and actually created parliamentary faction within Parliament of their own, which can change the votes because there are 20, 30, 40 MPs who are of the East India Company interest. So through lobbying, through bribery, and through just quiet influence, the East India Company creates a world for the first time where a corporate interest can turn its interest into the policy of a government, and making the interest of the shareholders the interest seem to be the interest of the state. And that's, of course, a system that exists today. Exxon has, it's not a secret. Exxon employs senators. It gives them salaries to lobby for it. And other businesses like Facebook, Amazon, and Google have the same to protect them from taxes. So, there are huge differences. Obviously, Amazon does not contain and does not have fighter jets or nuclear submarines, which would be the equivalent of the cutting-edge East India Company armies of the 18th century. But in some ways, you could argue that these corporations today are richer. Sorry, not richer. They are richer, but they're also more powerful because of surveillance capitalism. Anyone that's got their phone on listening to us this evening may well get East India Company tea adverts in their social media feed tomorrow morning. The way that our conversations can be spied on, the way we've all had these things where, we've mentioned a particular brand in conversation and bingo, there tomorrow in your Instagram feed or your Facebook or your Twitter is exactly the corporation that you mentioned in conversation. So this is going on, and this is a different sort of power, but it's certainly no lesser power.